Are we live streaming?
Let me see. I just turned it on.
Okay.
Let me make sure that it's working. Yep, it's working.
Okay. So should I begin?
Yeah, you should share the slides as a virtual background though, if you want that to be like on like a visual, I guess. If people,
Okay. Share the slides as a virtual background.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you just click on that file. That's the Raymond WJHU.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just so if you swipe off, people can still hear you talking. I think we've had like a couple bugs where like if you only use the sharing like the window feature, the sound like stops if you swipe off, which is bad. So yeah.
Wait, so this is not through share screen?
Oh no, this is through share screen. If you go to advanced sharing options,
Oh, I
like,
see.
yeah,
I see. Yeah, I see. Yep, thank you.
no problem.
PowerPoint is virtual background. Okay. It says I need to install a plugin. I guess I'll just do that right now.
It says you have to do that. Okay, that's weird.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess we'll be a tiny bit late, but
Yeah, sorry about that. Didn't know you had to have a plugin for this. But yes, we are live streaming. It's on Twitch, and then it'll also be on YouTube as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, feel free to record.
I see. I see. Yep. Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for your patience.
Yep. Okay. Can you make me co-host? Sorry.
Oh, did I not do that? Oh my God, I'm sorry. All right. All right. You're good to go.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your patience and welcome to Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, and listeners from around the world. I am Raymond Perez, and this is In Progress, the #1 political radio show at the Johns Hopkins University for now. This is our second show of the year, and as they say, second is the best. So be warned. We have a great show for you today. But, of course, we don't have time for a theme song because Joseph R. Biden, by the way, R stands for Robinette, I guess that works, has been elected the 46th president of the United States. Of course, Donald Trump and many of his supporters are refusing to accept the results of this election, which isn't ideal, of course, but we'll see where that ends up. First, we have something very important to get to. The entire point of this show, really, is to educate, but also to activate. Just because Donald Trump is not in the White House, and he still is, by the way, does not mean that we can go to sleep or go to brunch. We have to be active and stay active in our politics. You need to get involved. Of course, listening to progressive media and reposting progressive materials on Instagram is great, but it is not enough. That's why I'm going to first discuss major breaking political stories right here in Baltimore and Maryland generally, things that you can do. And right now, you can get involved by registering to vote for the Maryland College Democrats elections. Okay, so the College Democrats of Maryland is looking to elect the president, vice president, secretary, and various political directors. Recently, the election is being redone for certain reasons. I don't know if I can disclose them, but there are certain reasons that the election is being redone. And you can register to vote to have your say heard at tinyurl.com/cdmd register. You must be a student in a Maryland college to register and vote. Full disclosure, I am running as vice president on the Rebuild Maryland slate. I have won this election before. I am quite experienced in Democratic politics at this level. And frankly, the Maryland chapter has been languishing for a bit before my time, by the way. I was recently elected. And we need to revitalize Maryland to support the Georgia Democrats in their runoff election, the DC Democrats, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and of course, get Larry Hogan and the Republicans out of Maryland. Note, the election is on November 14th at 4:30 p.m. You must be registered by November 13th to vote. Again, that link is tinyurl.com/cdmd register, or you can go to my Instagram account at Real Raymond Perez. Yes. So frankly, with Joe Biden as our next president, what should we look forward to? Well, we have massive, massive news from the Biden transition team. This just came in an hour ago. The Baltimore Sun is reporting that Dr. Tom Inglesby, you may know him as director of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health's Center for Health Security, is on the HHS transition team. If you do not know, HHS is the Department of Health and Human Services. It is tasked with many things: Medicaid, Medicare, basically all the good health stuff that you know of. It is not the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health. You may know that from coronavirus coverage. The NIH is part of HHS. Currently, you may have heard of both of these agencies. They are different. However, HHS is still very important, and I think probably more important than the NIH. So you have Dr. Tom Inglesby as part of the HHS transition team for the Joe Biden administration. And you have Luciana Borio, who is an infectious disease physician from the Johns Hopkins University as well. Of course, as you may remember, Maryland was not the best state in the pandemic. It, of course, wasn't the worst. And these individuals, they advised Governor Larry Hogan, of course, the Republican governor of Maryland, on the pandemic. So we will definitely be waiting to see how it goes from there. There is, of course, going to be some issues with coronavirus. I am understating that, but there will definitely be some issues when Joe Biden becomes president. Of course, Donald Trump leaving the White House will not change necessarily the trajectory of coronavirus. It is really only something that we can do with each other in order to stop and stem the spread of COVID-19. So another major story is coming from Politico, frankly. Politico currently has a story. Now, to be fair, Politico has had some issues with stories like this. The story, by the way, is about the Biden cabinet. The Biden cabinet initial contenders have been revealed by Politico. But we must remember that Politico has not been the greatest on this, but also hasn't been the worst. In fact, they predicted Kamala Harris would be the vice president very early on. In fact, some people theorized that it was leaked to Politico. However, there is no proof of that. And it could be something that Politico did to get ahead of the story. But regardless, Politico broke the story first, regardless of whether it was true at the time. So Politico is giving us some news about the contenders for the Biden cabinet. Some progressives are not very happy about this. Some liberals are definitely going to be ecstatic when they read the list. But frankly, it's not all great. It's not all bad. People saying that it's all great or all bad, they're both kind of over exaggerating. The Biden administration kind of looks like the Obama administration part 3. And I guess that's what, it was supposed to be. It was meant to be that. It sort of seemed like it would be that from how Joe Biden was running the election in 2020. And frankly, it looks like a Hillary Clinton cabinet. It looks like an Obama cabinet. Frankly, it looks like a Bill Clinton cabinet. It looks like a cabinet that any Democrat would have. So those who were guessing it would be like a Bernie style cabinet, like some in the Trump administration, some Republican pundits saying that Bernie had actually taken control of the Democratic Party. Well, it definitely doesn't seem that way. There are a few issues with the Biden cabinet, and we'll get into them. But the first, probably most glaring issue comes from Defense Secretary who, well, of course, not Defense Secretary yet, but someone being considered for defense is Michelle Flournoy. Now, you may have heard Michelle Flournoy before. She is the CEO at West Exec Advisors. She was the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the co-founder of Center for a New American Security. Now, Flournoy has been described as a policy wonk, which, of course, if you know me, you know that I believe that policy wonks don't exist. But she has been described as a policy wonk. She was the undersecretary in Obama's first term. So it sort of seems like she's kind of a shoo-in for the spot. Now, frankly, I don't necessarily believe that she's a shoo-in for the spot. I wouldn't be shocked if she wasn't the Secretary of Defense, but Flournoy does seem slated to be the Secretary of Defense at the moment. Now, there are two other candidates for Secretary of Defense, according to Politico. You have Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth, who was also floated as Biden's vice president. Of course, that did not end up occurring. Tammy Duckworth is an Iraq war veteran. She was injured in Iraq when her helicopter was hit by an RPG, and she lost both of her legs. She is perhaps the most recognized disabled politician in this country, and she definitely deserves applause for her service in Iraq. And Tammy Duckworth was considered a fairly strong liberal until very recently, when I noticed that many on the progressive left began to turn on her. I'm not necessarily clear why. Of course, she is not a Bernie Sanders style progressive, but she is definitely a strong liberal, and I think that she would be a fine Secretary of Defense, probably better than Michelle Flournoy. Of course, Duckworth is fairly powerful in the Senate, so I don't know whether she would, frankly, accept Secretary of Defense. I don't necessarily see it as a step up. Secretary of Defense doesn't normally become president. And a lot of these people are career climbers. They want to ascend to the presidency at some point. There is the old saying that every senator looks in the mirror and sees a president, a future president. Now, that's the problem with Tammy Duckworth as Secretary of Defense. I don't really see that occurring because it's not a step up, frankly, especially when you are someone like Tammy Duckworth, who she was Assistant Secretary of Veterans Affairs during Obama. And frankly, Veterans Affairs, as I'm sure many people have said in the past, is kind of a dead end. After Veterans Affairs, you don't really go anywhere else. So Duckworth as defense, just coming off of Veterans Affairs, I don't necessarily see that as a major possibility, something to be worried about. So I would say Duckworth probably not going to be Secretary of Defense. Again, I'm leaning on Flournoy for that one, just as Politico is. So you have Jack Reed, another one on Secretary of Defense Democrat shortlist. He graduated from West Point, and he is the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee. So, again, the only problem with that is that Jack Reed, who was senator of Rhode Island, would become the chair of Armed Services if the Democrats win control of the Senate, which it doesn't seem likely at this point. That really depends on Georgia. So Jack Reed becoming Secretary of Defense doesn't seem very, very likely at the time. It seems much less likely than Flournoy, even less likely than Duckworth, frankly, because Reed is fairly powerful in the Senate, and as ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, I don't necessarily see him deciding to flip to the Secretary of Defense, flip to the executive, even though, honestly, it would probably not be the greatest thing for progressives in the Democratic Party, but it would probably be a normal liberal pick. It seems like something that would occur under any Obama administration. In fact, I believe he was on shortlist for Hillary Clinton. I remember reading that in 2016, that Jack Reed may be the Secretary of Defense. Of course, Flournoy was also floated in 2016. Flournoy, frankly, again, Secretary of Defense, or slated to be Secretary of Defense. Again, she was the Undersecretary of Defense under Obama. She is beginning to take a role on COVID-19. In fact, she said recently that COVID-19 is a national security issue, which is interesting. Many people consider it a public health issue, but Flournoy's basically posturing it as national security. Us progressives do know that when something is framed in national security language, it's not a good thing because it provides more credence to national security than it otherwise would deserve. But regardless, Flournoy is slated to be Secretary of Defense under Biden, and she is beginning to take a hard stance, not only on COVID-19, but also on China. The competition with China is such an interesting idea. Of course, China is generally considered our greatest geopolitical competitor. Famously, there was a massive push to bring China into the, let's find a good way to say this, to bring China into the international community, into the neoliberal order, frankly. And it began under Nixon, of course, with its inclusion into the United Nations, but it began to accelerate under Bill Clinton and George Bush, especially with normalized trade relations with China in the 2000s. So you definitely have some issues with China and America's relations. And Flournoy is really planning on taking a hard stance on China. Now, of course, you may remember Donald Trump took a very hard stance on China, and that was sort of an issue to many on the left, even some on the right, because many on the right believe in free trade, which, to their credit, free trade tends to be better than protectionism. I know that's not a progressive thing to say, but it's generally true. And there are definitely some issues with China and the US, of course. But the question is, do we need to take a hard stance on China? Frankly, I would argue yes, at least in the sense that we have a hard stance on Russia, which Russia is not necessarily that large of a geopolitical enemy anymore. Of course, Russia has an economy the size of Italy. The GDP of Russia is fairly low. So, especially GDP per capita, that is, I believe it is on the level of Mexico, which Mexico is generally considered a developing country. So that's that could be an issue for Russia going forward. But in China, you definitely have the beginnings of an increase in not only standard of living, but also geopolitical power, soft power, frankly, especially in Africa. So we'll be excited to see what Flournoy does. Excited in a morbid sense, because we do not necessarily know what Flournoy will do. And of course, we have been very disappointed by the Obama administration before. So let's hope that this liberal administration appoints a very astute Secretary of Defense. We'll move on to Secretary of State, which is a very connected role, frankly. Secretary of State is perhaps the most important post in the cabinet, other than Vice President, and even some would argue more important than Vice President. Barack Obama, of course, famously gave Hillary Clinton the Secretary of State position in 2008 after her loss in the primary. Now, Secretary of State tends to be a position that can elevate someone to president, to the media's consideration as president, I guess. So, of course, you had Hillary Clinton, who was an extremely, now this may be a bit controversial, but an extremely talented Secretary of State, especially with the Russian reset, which was a major step forward in Russo-American relations. But Hillary Clinton, of course, was not the only Democrat who has had a outsized role in the administration. Frankly, John Kerry also had a major role in the foreign policy of the Obama administration, with the Iran nuclear deal and the normalization of relations with Vietnam and Cuba. But these relations, I think that we can generally say the Trump administration has torn asunder. And now we are beginning to see a Secretary of State who may continue the Obama administration policies that were absolutely important in creating some sense of balance in the world. So, of course, the Trump administration had Rex Tillerson, who was fired fairly quickly, and then he, of course, had Mike Pompeo, who is currently the Secretary of State and currently facing scrutiny for comments surrounding the election. But it seems like Susan Rice, who is being floated for Secretary of State by the Biden administration, or by the Biden transition team, sorry, is a fairly experienced pick. So she is not Mike Pompeo, and she is not, definitely she's not Rex Tillerson, who was, I think, picked directly from Exxon. Susan Rice was, or it really is, frankly, one of the more important Democrats currently in office, or not in office, currently in the media eyes, I guess. So Susan Rice was the UN ambassador for Obama, and also, of course, the national security advisor. And currently, right now, she's at American University in Washington, D.C. So basically, the problem with Susan Rice at State Department is, again, one that the progressives generally have with foreign policy generally. And it is the fact that the Obama administration foreign policy was not the most progressive, one would say. There was definitely some problems, especially in Libya, which was perhaps one of the biggest failures of the Obama administration, the Libyan civil war, that definitely played a role in certain controversies in 2012. Of course, the most famous being the Benghazi controversy that engulfed Hillary Clinton, and also possibly Susan Rice was definitely involved in that. Although, of course, we must note that that Benghazi is not necessarily a very important thing. Now, excuse me, I was just notified that there was a comment left, but I can't find it. The person who commented, can you comment again? I see. I will continue on my coverage of Susan Rice. But yes, I'll definitely continue on my coverage of Susan Rice. Susan Rice was the UN ambassador and also was an Obama national security advisor. And definitely there were some issues with her in Isn't America's fault that China accumulated such power so that it can assert domination upon its geographic neighbors, primarily due to America's instability to diversify investments? Oh my God. Okay. So to that one, I would definitely say, yes, you definitely do have some problems with America. And it's okay. Let's see how to answer this one. Is it America's fault? Okay, so let me start over. Here is here is the question. Isn't it America's fault that China accumulated so much power so that it can assert domination upon its geographic neighbors, primarily due to America's inability to diversify investments? So what that means, frankly, is there's three issues that are present in this question. And the first one is China asserting domination upon its geographic neighbors? And the answer is yes. Of course, you have the South China Sea controversy, where China is building islands in the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, for instance, around that area. They're building islands, correct? And it's primarily to control trade in the region. The South China Sea is, I believe, the largest trade route, even surpassing many of the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific ones. So, of course, that's because China is such an important trade partner with America and with India and with so many other nations, especially in Africa. So the South China Sea is, frankly, in turmoil at the moment, because Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia and many other nations have a stake inside the South China Sea. So why has America not done anything about this? And I think that's the question that I really should be answering. The answer really is that America tried to do things about it under the Obama administration. So you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the trade agreement between America and, I believe, I'll say 19 other countries, but it may be maybe more, maybe less. And it was a very 10 other countries, or 13 other countries, excuse me. And it was basically a containment of China. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a trade agreement between, or it would have been a trade agreement between America and Australia, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, Vietnam, Japan, New Zealand, etc. And basically, it would have eliminated barriers to trade for many nations that did not have necessarily the best access to American to American markets as China did. So TPP would have contained China in a very real way by taking many of its trade partners and integrating them more into the American sphere of influence. So to a very large extent, yes, it is America's fault that China accumulated such power because of the American retrenchment from global politics. Now, very quickly, for all the people in the chat who are listening, who are not IR majors, the word retrenchment means the move back into. I'm trying to think of how to explain this. The word retrenchment means basically a return to isolationism. If I can say that, I don't necessarily believe that that's the exact definition, but it's good enough. Basically, under the Trump administration, you had isolation from certain allies, especially NATO, especially in Australia, and in many other regions. You definitely had America moving out of those regions. And that was especially major in Southeast Asia. So what the Biden administration would do, probably under Susan Rice, probably under Michelle Flournoy, is it would begin to take those relations back, frankly. And that would be probably a very good thing for America and for a future Biden administration, especially if you consider yourself a realist and you are looking at specifically the balance of power between America and China. So yes, that's a good question. And the answer is yes, it is America's fault. And it's primarily actually Trump's fault, although there is definitely some blame to go around for the Bush administration and for the first half of the Obama administration. Although I would believe in the second half of the Obama administration, you did have a move against China in TPP, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that's a good point. In terms of secretaries of state, we are talking about Susan Rice, who would definitely get a lot of Republican opposition from her involvement in Benghazi. So would that hurt Rice? The answer is probably yes. So you need 50 votes, probably. Yeah, you need 51 votes to become to be inside the cabinet. And if the Senate is 52-48, which it seems like it's going to be, because Georgia has 2 seats up, but those seats are not likely to go to the Democratic Party. Of course, you have Jon Ossoff and Warnock, Raphael Warnock, running, and they're against they're the Democrats, and they're against David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, who, by the way, both of them are definitely not good. They're definitely very, very bad. So progressives need to definitely mobilize. But it seems very likely that the Democrats will lose the Senate. Um, if you have a 52-48 Senate, which seems likely, you probably will begin to see major issues, frankly. So Susan Rice, who has some culpability in Benghazi, although again, Benghazi was not necessarily that big of an issue. Especially, I mean, the handling of Benghazi was not necessarily that big of a scandal. But the Republican Party definitely made it one on Fox News. So the problem with Susan Rice would be whether she would get those 50 votes or 51 votes to become Secretary of State. And the answer is maybe not, because of how of how polarized or really how entrenched the Republican Party is against Susan Rice because of her role in Benghazi, in the same way that they were entrenched against Hillary Clinton. So yeah, that's another interesting pick. Of course, you may have two others as Secretary of State. You may have William Burns, and you may also have Chris Coons. So William Burns is an ambassador, and he is president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Chris Coons, who is a bit more interesting here, is the Delaware senator, who, of course, a Democrat, who held the seat once held by Joe Biden. So him as Secretary of State would be very interesting. And he actually has expressed some interest. Now, do I believe that you would see a Secretary of State, Chris Coons? No. And the reason why is because Susan Rice is almost definitely going to get the job. She is 100% more capable than Chris Coons and 100% more qualified than Chris Coons. To the extent that we should support Susan Rice, and the answer really is, I don't really see why we should. She's not necessarily that large of a progressive, but she definitely does have a lot of experience. So Secretary of State Susan Rice probably going to happen. Chris Coons has been floated. Also, I didn't mention this, but Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy has been floated. I don't see either of those two getting the nod. I think you're going to see Secretary of State Susan Rice, frankly. So next you have the Treasury. Treasury is, I don't know. The Treasury is a bit difficult, frankly. I don't necessarily believe that the Treasury is going to go to who Politico says it's going to go to. Politico is saying it may go to Lael Brainard, who is the Federal Reserve, who is a Federal Reserve governor, and she used to be Undersecretary of the Treasury. Now, there is actually a major reason for progressives to be involved inside the fight for Secretary of the Treasury. And that's because Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has been floated as Secretary of Treasury. So Republicans, frankly, are going to control the Senate. So is it going to be possible to get Elizabeth Warren as Secretary of Treasury? Answer, maybe not. Nominating a progressive will probably be a large fight. And I don't know if the Democratic Party wants to expand the political capital to get Senator Warren as Secretary of the Treasury. Maybe with the Democratic Senate, if Ossoff and Warnock take their respective seats in Georgia, perhaps it's possible. But I don't see it happening at this time. So, Secretary of Treasury Elizabeth Warren, not going to really happen. But Lael Brainard, now that's different. She does not necessarily have that much of any opposition to her. She's really just been on the Federal Reserve. She worked at Obama's Treasury, and she really does have support from both sides. It's really more of a compromise pick, Brainard. And she would be the first woman to lead the department. Though to what extent that is a very important issue is not necessarily known at this time. I guess to use something politically correct. I don't necessarily know if that's super important, the first woman to lead the Secretary of the Treasury. And the reason why is because Elizabeth Warren would also be the first woman to lead the Secretary of the Treasury. And basically everyone floated would be the first woman to lead the Secretary of the Treasury, because you know, there are many qualified women to have this post. So mainly the Biden administration is considering women or some Black women like Melody Hobson of DreamWorks Animation to be Secretary of Treasury. But Leo Brainard seems like a fine pick. Elizabeth Warren, of course, would be better. She, as you know, probably, she chaired the Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP. TARP was a troubled asset relief program. It helped homeowners in 2008 and in the 2008 crisis. And of course, Elizabeth Warren is probably the most important person inside, the most important progressive critic of the Obama administration during its first 4 years, and she won a very close race against Massachusetts Senator Scott Brown, I believe in 2010. So she definitely she definitely would be a good pick, especially for consumers, especially for progressives. But it doesn't seem likely that she will be chosen. Next, and arguably, again, one of the more important positions is Department of Justice. So, of course, the person who leads the Department of Justice is not called the Secretary of Justice. They are called the Attorney General. The Attorney General is, some people are saying, Doug Jones at this point. Now, Doug Jones just recently lost his Senate race in Alabama. You may remember that Doug Jones ran against Roy Moore in Alabama in 2017. During a special election, Roy Moore was accused of sexual misconduct, I will say, as a euphemism, with those who were underage. I will again say as a euphemism. So Doug Jones just narrowly beat him. Of course, Roy Moore opposed that characterization of him. He definitely denied the allegations, but and many Republicans, of course, believed him because Fox News also denied the allegations. But Doug Jones actually won that election. Now, Doug Jones is primarily known for being the former U.S. attorney in Alabama. Now, that's why he won the election in Alabama. He, in fact, prosecuted the 2 members of the KKK who were involved in the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And he did that in probably, I believe he did that in the 90s, that prosecution. And they actually got them convicted, which was, of course, a major boon to his reputation. Now, Jones, of course, has been friends with Biden for a while. I believe Jones endorsed Biden very quickly, like right out of the gate in when he declared that he was running for president. In fact, Jones was a friend of Biden in 1988, being part of Biden's first campaign in 1988. So Jones will have some competition for the Attorney General post. Now, even this is in fact very weird. Chair of the DNC, Democratic National Committee, chair of the DNC, Tom Perez, who was Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and of course, I know him primarily as Secretary of Labor, and also chair of the DNC, as I just said. He is making plays to become Attorney General. Now, there are some issues with Tom Perez, of course, being Attorney General. Doug Jones, of course, will probably be a more qualified Attorney General, but Tom Perez definitely has more power within the party. Tom Perez also is Latino, and that must be considered. He has a lot of Latino institutional support, especially from lobbyists, especially from Latino Democrats around the country. When I say Latino Democrats, I don't mean the voters. I mean like officials, Latino Democrat officials. So Perez has some experience in the Justice Department. As I said, he was assistant attorney general under Obama, but Obama wanted him to be labor secretary, so he became labor secretary in, I believe, 2013. Now, the only problem with Tom Perez is that the Republicans don't like him either. The same way that they don't like Susan Rice, they don't like Tom Perez. So that is a major issue for many Democrats, because if you nominate someone who doesn't get in office, you're primarily just wasting time. So no Republican voted to confirm him as labor secretary in 2013. So it seems fairly unlikely that he will be nominated and also confirmed. So I think Tom Perez probably not going to be the nominee for attorney general, frankly. Next is Sally Yates, who has been mentioned. She was the deputy attorney general in the Obama administration. In fact, Sally Yates may probably be well known for what happened in the first months of the Obama administration, or first months of the Trump administration, rather, because President Donald Trump fired her because she refused to defend his Muslim ban. Of course, Donald Trump would say the Muslim ban was not really a Muslim ban, but of course it was. Or at least it was an executive order that banned entry to people only from several Muslim countries. So, you know. Did I just randomly cut out? Okay. It seems like I just cut out. Yeah. Okay. It's very weird. Okay. Yes. So Xavier Becerra is another candidate that has been considered for attorney general. And excuse me, let me get this set up first. Yes. So Xavier Becerra is another potential candidate. But it seems very unlikely that he will get the job because Gavin Newsom basically said that he will make Becerra senator from California after Kamala Harris becomes vice president. So it seems fairly unlikely that will occur. Becerra becoming attorney general, that is. So if I were to put a bet on it, I would say attorney general, most likely Doug Jones, second most likely Sally Yates, Tom Perez as a dark horse, but I don't see Tom Perez getting the job. So Doug Jones as attorney general seems very likely to me. The next one that's probably extremely important right now, and I started the segment off with Health and Human Services, or at least Hopkins staffers involved in the Health and Human Services transition. I'm going to discuss, of course, HHS. So, oh, yeah, let me see this. Okay. Thank you very much. So, okay, so there was another question asked while I was away, sadly. My computer cut out, so I didn't see it. But this is the question. Can you expand on the socioeconomic diversification that America could pursue in the future to avoid threatening alien influxes of economic and global power not in the favor of global markets? I think for that one, I will say that there are a lot of capital markets right now that are open that are not being invested in nearly as much as they should be. And the most major of those is Africa. So of course, in the late 1800s, moving back to the late 1800s, you had a South America that was very underdeveloped and that needed investment from Western powers. And it did happen primarily due to the U.S., but also due to Britain, due to France, due to Germany. Germany, I think, very famously invested in Venezuela. But you have the same thing occurring right now in Africa, except right now it's not really America doing much investment. America does have some allies in Africa, primarily in the north, primarily in the west. The most major African allies that I can think of, Egypt and Morocco. Of course, China has a lot more allies in Africa due to a large portion of investments, a large portion of loans that have been going to places like Cameroon, going to places like Tanzania in the east and Cameroon in the west, going to many of these places. Now, I don't necessarily see America becoming the reason why I don't see America diversifying its investments in terms of global diversification is primarily because I don't see. It's primarily because America is a capitalist nation, and there's not much room, and it doesn't seem right now that there will be a short-term gain from those investments, and capitalism definitely favors short-term gains. So the investments that America can make are primarily in Africa, which has not been invested in nearly as much as it should be, especially in America. But China is definitely investing a lot in Africa. And not only that, you have definitely a large portion of investments in developing nations being made by places like China and Japan, and not necessarily America, primarily because America does not make investments in that way, because there doesn't seem to be any short-term gain from that. Now, America did make some investments in China. That's primarily through the IMF, but sorry, but you definitely do have some issues with America diversifying, and it hasn't happened yet. I don't see it happening in the near future. I don't think it's a Trump or Biden problem. I think it's a capitalism problem. So we will definitely look into that at some point. I don't necessarily see it being a major thing on the Biden administration's mind, although some would argue it probably should be. And I definitely don't see the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense doing much to, or maybe not defense, but Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce. I don't really see them doing much on that front. Now, Commerce has a very strong issue on trade right now. It seems like Commerce is going to be ruled. It's going to be led by Meg Whitman, who is a major free trader. She's also a Republican, so it's a little bit disheartening to get a Republican in Commerce. But Meg Whitman, who was the CEO of Quibi, which of course, if you know anything about Quibi, you know how absolutely magnificently it failed. It failed very, very magnificently. It was quite funny to some progressives, but definitely Meg Whitman could be Commerce, because Biden has said that he will put a Republican in the cabinet. Meg Whitman may be that Republican. There are definitely worse choices like John Kasich. There are definitely worse choices, but Meg Whitman is like a California Republican. So of course she's not like a Trumpist. She's not even like a Kasich, but she's more like a Romney. And I wouldn't really love to see Secretary Romney either. So Meg Whitman in commerce will be pro free trade, which is good, frankly. But Meg Whitman not my favorite person to lead commerce, frankly. So I don't think that she will do much on that front, on the front of diversification of investments from America. Frankly, it doesn't seem to be that way. Okay, so it says here that Meg Whitman was the former Republican candidate for governor of California. So I assume that means that she ran against Jerry Brown, but she could have ran against Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom is, of course, the current governor. Jerry Brown was governor before him. Jerry Brown was very old, actually. I believe he ran against Bill Clinton even in 1992. But Jerry Brown was also a very good governor of California, especially compared to, I believe, even compared to his successor, who of course is Gavin Newsom. Now, Jerry Brown, and also believe his predecessor was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah, but I believe that to be the case. But yeah, Meg Whitman ran against Jerry Brown, and of course lost because she was a Republican running in California, and she didn't star in a movie, unlike Reagan and Schwarzenegger. But also, she was the CEO of eBay, CEO of Hewlett Packard, CEO of Quibi, as we just discussed. So it seems likely that she will be Commerce Department, but at least that means that there won't be another Republican inside the Biden administration. So, and yes, back to the question, I don't see her doing much on that front. There is another person who could be Secretary of Commerce, Terry McAuliffe, who was Virginia governor. That would be a much better choice. McAuliffe was a major Clintonite, but at least a Clintonite isn't a Republican. So maybe putting a Clintonite in office would be fairly good. Terry McAuliffe would be a good one for that. Now, it also seems like there are a few that I want to get to. I'll get to three more that I think are kind of important. Number one is labor. Labor seems like it could be labor right now seems like it could be like sort of someone that we don't know. Julie Su has been floated. Julie Su, of course, Secretary of California Labor. Bill Spriggs, who is the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. That would be a good one for progressives. But also, Senator Bernie Sanders has been floated as labor secretary. Now, that's kind of a long shot. Bernie is senator of Vermont. Vermont has a Republican governor. It doesn't seem very likely that. And of course, when a senator resigns, the governor can appoint whoever he wants to be senator. So to be interim senator. So some people don't want to take the chance that if Bernie resigns, that you get a Republican in Vermont. Although, of course, Vermont Republicans aren't necessarily the most right-wing people. Governor Phil Scott, who is perhaps the most important Vermont Republican, wasn't at all a conservative, I believe, during his campaign. He was definitely more of a moderate. So he also voted for Joe Biden, I believe. He may have actually endorsed Joe Biden. I think Charlie Baker in Massachusetts did as well. But who, by the way, that's why Elizabeth Warren wouldn't be Treasury, because you have a Republican governor. A Republican governor can put a Republican senator in. So we don't want another Scott Brown, right? So yeah, there are definitely a few issues with that. So labor as Bernie Sanders doesn't seem likely. Pete Buttigieg has been floated for Veterans Affairs. He seems like a front runner for Veterans Affairs, but he's also been floated as UN ambassador. UN ambassador, I see him being because, frankly, Veterans Affairs is kind of like a dead end, as I believe I mentioned. So if Pete Buttigieg becomes Veterans Affairs, there's almost no chance that he becomes president or vice president or anything after that, because Veterans Affairs is kind of a dead end. Just because Veterans Affairs is so badly managed that if you become Veterans Affairs secretary, that can be blamed on you, and then you would never get another job again because of how precious veterans are to the American populace. So if people just gets Veterans Affairs, I don't see him really coming back from that. That could be good for some, not good for others. But regardless, that's probably the truth. Next is Department of Agriculture. This is another interesting one. So the USDA isn't necessarily that powerful, but it definitely is or it doesn't get that much media attention, but definitely is fairly powerful. So the front runner is Heidi Heitkamp. You may remember her from losing the North Dakota Senate race. She was actually senator for North Dakota in 2012. She won, but in 2018 she definitely lost, and she lost very badly. But that's also part of her. But it's also part of a result of polarization in this country. So Heitkamp as USDA seems possible. I wouldn't put my money on it, but Heitkamp and USDA. I've heard Klobuchar from Minnesota, Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, being voted for VA, not VA, for USDA. So there were definitely some issues there, but I don't necessarily see it being that big of a deal. And so we're nearing the end. There are 2 minutes left. So I'll definitely just restate something major. There are elections coming up, as I recently said. For those of us who are just joining, there are elections in the Maryland College Democrats. It's there. There are some reasons for these new elections, but basically, you need to register to vote. And to register to vote, it is tinyurl.com/cdmdregister. I'll say it again, tinyurl.com/cdmdregister. The election is on November 14th at 4:30 p.m., and you must be registered by November 13th to vote. With that, I will close out. I think next week, I thought we were going to cover executive actions this week. We were probably not going to. Next week, we'll get into what happened in the Senate and the House, and of course, what happened in the presidency. As you know, the presidency has been called. Senate and the House have not been called. And it's been a very close election. So we're going to look at why the polls were so wrong and what the Trump and Biden teams both did badly. So you can watch us at twitch.tv/WJHU radio or listen after in some way. And you can definitely stay with WJHU. There are some phenomenal shows in the lineup at the moment. I will be there next week, if you will. And remember that the change that we need to see is always in progress. Thank you very much for watching.